They whispered their final prayers expecting execution, but what arrived instead was the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon. September 17, 1945. Baguio, Philippines. 28 Japanese women knelt in the mud outside a makeshift American military compound, hands clasped not in surrender, but in preparation for death. Most were nurses, a few were civilian volunteers who had followed the Imperial Army into the mountains. They had spent the last 3 weeks hiding in caves, surviving on wild roots and rainwater, watching their male counterparts either die in combat or disappear into the jungle. When the American patrol found them at dawn, weak and fever-ridden, they assumed the end had come. Every woman in that group had heard the stories. The propaganda pamphlets distributed by Imperial headquarters painted American soldiers as demons who tortured prisoners, violated women, and delighted in cruelty. Radio broadcasts before the Japanese surrender had been explicit. Capture meant dishonor worse than death. For weeks, the commanding officer of their field hospital unit had carried cyanide capsules, distributing them to nurses with instructions to use them if Americans approached. But the capsules had been lost during the chaotic retreat through the Philippine jungle, leaving these women defenseless against what they believed would be their inevitable humiliation. They didn't resist when the American soldiers gestured for them to stand. They didn't protest when they were loaded onto trucks. They remained silent during the hour-long drive down mountain roads, convinced each turn brought them closer to whatever horrors awaited. When the truck stopped at Camp John Hay, a former American rest facility now converted into a processing center, the women stepped down with the mechanical movements of the condemned. What happened next would take decades for some of them to fully comprehend. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Lost Portraits. We bring you the untold stories of humanity found in history's darkest moments. Drop a comment below telling us where you're re-watching from. Your support helps us preserve these forgotten encounters. Now, let's return to September 1945, where 28 Japanese women are about to experience something their propaganda never prepared them for. This is a story about the systematic dismantling of fear through unexpected kindness. It's about what happens when human beings conditioned to expect monsters encounter ordinary people instead. In September 1945, as Japan reeled from atomic devastation and unconditional surrender, thousands of Japanese military personnel scattered across the Pacific faced a choice: die in the jungle or face capture by an enemy they'd been taught to fear more than death itself. For the 28 women who arrived at Camp John Hay that morning, fear had become their entire reality. They had watched the war deteriorate from confident advance to desperate retreat. They had treated wounded soldiers who screamed warnings about American savagery between morphine-induced hallucinations. They had seen their own command structure collapse into chaos, leaving them stranded in a foreign land with no protection and no hope. The propaganda they'd absorbed wasn't just information, it was identity. To be Japanese meant to never surrender. To fall into enemy hands meant betraying not just military duty, but cultural essence. The shame of capture, they'd been told, extended beyond the individual to family, ancestors, and nation. Death was preferable because death was honorable. Survival as a prisoner meant becoming something less than human. So, when the American soldiers escorted them from the trucks toward a long wooden building, the women expected processing before punishment. When they were directed into a room with wooden benches and told to sit, they complied with the resignation of those who have stopped fighting fate. A few wept silently, others sat rigid, eyes fixed on nothing. One nurse, later identified in Red Cross records as Fumiko Tanaka, began reciting Buddhist prayers under her breath, preparing her spirit for transition. They waited in that room for approximately 40 minutes, according to the camp's daily log. What they didn't know was that on the other side of the compound, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Captain Robert Morrison, the officer in charge of displaced persons processing, had assembled his small staff, 2 nurses, 3 interpreters, and a cook borrowed from the enlisted mess. His instructions from command had been clear: Japanese POWs were to be treated according to Geneva Convention standards, regardless of how Japan had treated American prisoners. But Morrison, a former high school principal from Ohio, had decided to go further. "These women think we're going to kill them," he told his staff that morning. "I want the first thing they experience to be impossible to reconcile with what they've been told. Something so ordinary, so American, that it short-circuits the propaganda." What Morrison ordered prepared was breakfast, not military rations, not minimal compliance with prisoner feeding requirements, but an actual American breakfast: coffee, eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, canned fruit, and fresh milk obtained from a local dairy that had somehow survived the occupation. It was the kind of meal most Americans took for granted, the kind of abundance that defined home. To serve it to enemy prisoners less than a month after Japan's surrender was, in Morrison's calculation, either profound psychological warfare or radical compassion. Possibly both. When the door opened and two American nurses entered pushing a cart laden with food, the Japanese women initially didn't understand what they were seeing. The aroma hit them first: coffee, a luxury they hadn't experienced in years, and bacon, a food many had only encountered when stationed in occupied territories. The nurses, both women in their 20s who were in crisp white uniforms, began distributing plates with general efficiency, setting them on the benches in front of each prisoner. No one moved. 28 women sat frozen, staring at plates of hot food, unable to process the reality before them. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't even neutral maintenance. This was hospitality, and it made no sense whatsoever.
To understand the paralysis those women felt, we need to step back 18 months to March 1944, when most of them had been selected for overseas deployment. The Imperial Japanese Army had maintained military nursing services since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, but by 1944, the system was collapsing under the weight of impossible casualties and shrinking resources. Unlike their American counterparts, who received formal medical training and officer commissions, Japanese military nurses occupied an ambiguous position: essential but not quite military, respected but not empowered, expected to sacrifice everything while receiving minimal preparation. Most of the women who would eventually end up at Camp John Hay had been recruited from nursing schools in Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto during 1943 and early 1944. They ranged in age from 19 to 32. Some came from military families and saw service as patriotic duty. Others had been effectively conscripted through social pressure so intense that refusal meant family dishonor. All received abbreviated training: basic wound care, disease management, surgical assistance, before being shipped to field hospitals across the Pacific. Fumiko Tanaka, the nurse who would later become one of the few to write about her experience, had been a second-year nursing student in Tokyo when her school was mobilized. In her memoir, published privately in Japan in 1968, she described the farewell ceremony: families weeping, instructors delivering speeches about noble sacrifice, and an underlying current of fear no one acknowledged directly. "We knew the war was not going well," she wrote, "but we had been raised to believe Japanese spirit would overcome material disadvantage. We boarded the transport ship believing we would serve briefly and return victorious. The reality waiting in the Philippines shattered that belief within weeks." The field hospital unit these women joined was stationed near Baguio, a mountain city that had served as the summer capital during American colonial administration. By spring 1944, it was a strategic position in Japan's defensive perimeter. The hospital itself was a collection of bamboo structures and canvas tents, chronically short of supplies, overwhelmed with casualties from both combat and tropical disease. The work was brutal. Nurses worked 12-hour shifts, often longer when casualties arrived from nearby fighting. They treated wounds with insufficient anesthetic, performed amputations with sterilized but primitive tools, and watched young soldiers die from infections that penicillin, unavailable to Japanese forces, could have cured easily. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever ravaged both patients and staff. By late 1944, several nurses had died from disease, and the rest were chronically malnourished and exhausted. But physical hardship wasn't their greatest burden. The propaganda that saturated every aspect of Japanese military life weighed heavier. Daily radio broadcasts reinforced the message. Americans were barbaric, racially inferior, motivated by hatred of Japanese civilization. Captured soldiers were tortured for information, then executed. Captured women faced fates too terrible to name explicitly. The propaganda relied on innuendo and cultural assumptions about honor to fill in horrifying details. This messaging wasn't accidental. The Imperial Japanese government had spent decades constructing a worldview in which surrender was literally unthinkable. The 1941 military code Senjin-kun stated explicitly, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a dishonorable name." For male soldiers, this meant fighting to death or suicide. For female nurses, the implications were even darker. Capture meant not just personal dishonor but sexual violation, a fate considered worse than any death. The women internalized this completely. In Fumiko's memoir, she describes a conversation with fellow nurse Keiko Yamamoto in July 1945, as American forces advanced and Japanese defenses crumbled. They discussed their cyanide capsules the way other young women might discuss jewelry, personal items to be treasured and used at the appropriate moment. "We agreed we would take them together," Fumiko wrote. "We didn't want to die alone, but we were certain death was preferable to what the Americans would do." The propaganda was reinforced by stories, some true, many fabricated or exaggerated, about Allied treatment of Japanese prisoners. Nurses heard tales of Japanese soldiers bayoneted after surrendering, of wounded troops burned alive, of prisoners starved and beaten. What they didn't hear, because it contradicted the official narrative, was that thousands of Japanese POWs were being held in American camps under conditions that, while not luxurious, followed Geneva Convention standards. The information blackout was nearly complete. By mid-1945, the field hospital unit had no reliable communication with Japanese command. They received occasional radio broadcasts, all propaganda. They had no access to newspapers, no contact with civilian populations who might have offered different perspectives. Their entire understanding of reality came from official sources and from each other, an echo chamber of fear. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, the nurses learned about it through garbled radio transmissions that emphasized American cruelty while omitting details about Japan's impending surrender. When Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast reached them on August 15th, the reaction wasn't relief but panic. Their commanding officer, a major who had already been wounded twice, gathered the unit and delivered a speech that Fumiko remembered decades later. "The war is over, but our duty is not. We cannot allow ourselves to fall into enemy hands. We will retreat into the mountains and await orders. If orders do not come, we will choose honor." For 3 weeks they lived in caves. Food ran out within days. They boiled water from streams and ate whatever vegetation looked edible. Several nurses developed severe dysentery. One died from infection after cutting her foot on a rock. The major, increasingly unstable, talked constantly about American patrols hunting them, about the necessity of dying rather than surrendering. When the American patrol finally found them on September 17th, the major had disappeared during the night. Suicide, most believed, though his body was never recovered. The nurses were too weak to run, too sick to resist. They allowed themselves to be captured not because they'd changed their minds about Americans, but because they lacked the strength to choose death. And then they sat in that room at Camp John Hay, staring at plates of bacon and eggs, and everything they believed began to crack. The standoff lasted 7 minutes, though it felt longer to everyone present. 28 Japanese women sat rigid on wooden benches, staring at food they refused to touch. 2 American nurses stood nearby, uncertain whether to speak or wait. Captain Morrison watched from the doorway, second-guessing his breakfast strategy. The room smelled like coffee and fear. Fumiko Tanaka would later describe the thoughts racing through her mind in those minutes. The food was poisoned, obviously, or drugged to make them compliant before the real horrors began. Or perhaps it was a test. Anyone who ate would be marked as weak, lacking in Japanese spirit, and singled out for punishment. Or maybe it was mockery. He'd a final cruel abundance before starvation. Her propaganda-trained mind generated explanations faster than reality could refute them. One of the American nurses, Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, 24, from Philadelphia, made the first move. She picked up a piece of bacon from one of the plates, ate it, and smiled. Then she poured herself coffee from the pot, took a sip, and offered the cup to the nearest Japanese woman, a young nurse named Hana Sato, who sat at the end of the first bench. Hana stared at the offered cup like it might bite her. Lieutenant Brennan held it steady, still smiling, saying nothing. The language barrier made words useless anyway. After a long moment, Hana reached out with trembling hands and took the cup. She sniffed it. Real coffee. Unmistakably, and then, with the caution of someone defusing a bomb, took the smallest possible sip. The taste of actual coffee after years of acorn substitutes and deprivation hit her system like electricity. She took another sip, then another. Around her, other women watched this small act of courage with intensity that bordered on desperation. If Hana died or collapsed, it would confirm their fears. If she survived. Hana didn't die. She finished the coffee. Lieutenant Brennan refilled the cup and gestured to the bacon. Slowly, moving with the deliberation of someone crossing a minefield, Hana picked up a piece and ate it. The salt and fat tasted like a memory from another lifetime. That's when the dam broke. Not all at once. Fear doesn't evaporate that quickly, but gradually. One woman reached for toast. Another tasted eggs. Within 15 minutes, all 28 women were eating, some crying as they did, overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance of experiencing kindness from the enemy they'd been taught to hate and fear. Captain Morrison had chosen his moment carefully. He entered the room with 3 interpreters, Japanese-American soldiers from the 432nd Regimental Combat Team, Nisei men who spoke both languages fluently and understood both cultures intimately. The sight of Japanese faces in American uniforms created another crack in the prisoners' worldview. These men had chosen American service, fought for America, and clearly hadn't been treated as the propaganda suggested Americans treated anyone of Japanese descent. Through the interpreters, Morrison delivered a short speech. He explained that they were prisoners of war, that they would be processed and held until arrangements could be made for repatriation to Japan. He told them they would receive medical examinations, clean clothes, and housing in a separate compound. He stated clearly that they would not be harmed, that American military regulations required humane treatment of all prisoners, and that anyone who mistreated them would face court-martial. The women listened in stunned silence. The words contradicted everything they believed about American military culture. Several were visibly skeptical. This had to be temporary, a facade that would drop once they were properly imprisoned. Others seemed confused, unable to reconcile the man speaking calmly in front of them with the demons their propaganda had described. What happened next would become the story Fumiko Tanaka told most often in her later years. The detail that convinced her the Americans' humanity was genuine. One of the women, a nurse named Yuki Kawamura, had been sick with dysentery for over a week. During the meal, she suddenly became ill, vomiting onto the floor in front of everyone. She began crying immediately, not from physical distress but from shame, certain this loss of composure would trigger punishment. Lieutenant Brennan moved immediately, not with disgust but with professional concern. She helped Yuki to her feet, guided her to a basin, and cleaned her face with a damp cloth while speaking softly in English words Yuki couldn't understand, but whose tone was unmistakably gentle. Another American nurse cleaned the floor without comment, treating it as routine rather than offense. Within minutes, Yuki was lying on a cot in an adjacent room, receiving fluids and medication while the others finished their meal. That moment changed everything, Fumiko wrote in her memoir. We had been told Americans saw us as less than human. But the way Lieutenant Brennan cared for Yuki-san, it was exactly how we had been trained to care for our own soldiers. There was no anger, no punishment, just professionalism. Kindness, even. We didn't understand it. After the meal, the medical examinations began. This was the moment the women had feared most, the vulnerability of physical inspection by enemy personnel. The propaganda had been especially lurid about what happened to captured women during medical processing, planting images of violation disguised as examination. Instead, they encountered Lieutenant Dorothy Chen, a Chinese-American doctor from San Francisco, and her team of female nurses. The examinations took place in a private room, one woman at a time, with female interpreters present. The protocol was identical to standard military medical intake. Check for injuries, document illness, test for contagious diseases, provide treatment for immediate concerns. Every woman received treatment for malnutrition, several for dysentery and infected wounds, 2 for malaria. The professionalism was absolute. No one was touched inappropriately. No one was mocked or degraded. The American medical staff treated Japanese prisoners with the same clinical efficiency they would treat their own troops, noting symptoms, dispensing medication, documenting conditions in careful handwriting on medical forms. Each woman also received a basic hygiene kit: soap, a toothbrush, a comb, sanitary supplies, and a towel. These simple items, mundane to Americans, felt like treasures to women who'd been living in caves. When Fumiko received her soap, actual soap, not the caustic substitute they'd used in the field hospital, she held it to her nose and inhaled the clean scent, then began crying again. We couldn't understand why they were giving us these things, she later explained. In our minds, prisoners didn't deserve comfort. Enemies especially didn't deserve kindness. But here were our enemies, the Americans we'd been taught to fear, treating us better than our own command had treated us in months. It made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. By evening, all 28 women had been medically cleared, fed a second meal, stew, bread, canned peaches, and assigned to a barracks in the women's compound. The barracks had cots with actual mattresses, blankets, mosquito netting, and access to showers with running water. After weeks in caves and months in deteriorating field conditions, it felt impossibly luxurious. That first night, most of the women couldn't sleep despite their exhaustion. They lay awake processing the day's impossibilities, trying to reconcile their lived experience with their trained expectations. Some still believed the kindness was temporary, a prelude to eventual cruelty. Others began questioning everything they'd been told. A few, like Fumiko, felt something close to grief. Grief for the fear they'd carried unnecessarily, for the soldiers who'd died rather than surrendered to treatment that turned out to be humane. In the darkness, someone began to cry. Then another. Soon, quiet weeping filled the barracks. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming release of tension they'd carried for so long it had become part of their identity. The Americans had brought them coffee, eggs, and bacon, and in doing so had begun dismantling an entire architecture of lies. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Trust, once shattered by propaganda and reinforced by war, rebuilds slowly, in moments small enough to seem insignificant. For the first 3 days at Camp John Hay, most of the 28 women remained guarded. They ate the food provided, 3 meals daily, portions that exceeded what they'd seen in years, but ate silently, speaking only in whispers among themselves. They used the showers but bathed quickly, still expecting some violation of privacy that never came. They attended daily medical check-ins but answered questions with minimal responses, certain that detailed information would be used against them somehow. The American staff, to their credit, didn't force interaction. They maintained professional distance, provided services efficiently, and otherwise left the Japanese women to process their situation at their own pace. This restraint, paradoxically, did more to build trust than aggressive friendliness would have. It communicated respect, an acknowledgement that these women had agency even as prisoners. The first crack in the wall of silence came from an unexpected source: chocolate. One of the interpreters, Sergeant Kenneth Yamamoto of the 442nd, had a mother who sent him care packages from California. In late September, a box arrived containing Hershey bars, cookies, and dried fruit. Sergeant Yamamoto, in what his commanding officer would later describe as either brilliant psychology or simple kindness, distributed the chocolate among the Japanese prisoners during his next translation shift. Fumiko Tanaka described receiving her piece of chocolate with something close to reverence. "I hadn't tasted chocolate since before the war," she wrote. "In Japan, it had been a rare luxury. In the field hospital, it was a fantasy. When Sergeant Yamamoto handed me that small brown square, I thought perhaps I was hallucinating from malnutrition." She ate it slowly, letting it melt on her tongue, and for those few moments allowed herself to feel something other than fear or confusion. When she thanked Sergeant Yamamoto in Japanese, he responded in the same language, the first extended conversation any of the women had with their captors. He told her about California, about his family's farm, about fighting in Italy while his parents were held in American incarceration camps. His story was complicated in ways the propaganda had never acknowledged. A Japanese American who had suffered at American hands but still fought for America, who understood both cultures but belonged fully to neither. For Fumiko, this conversation was revelatory. He helped me understand that the world was not divided simply into Japanese and American, honor and shame, victim and enemy. There were layers I had never been taught to see. Over the following weeks, small gestures accumulated. Lieutenant Brennan brought flowering plants from the camp garden to brighten the barracks. Dr. Chen spent extra time with Yuki Kawamura, whose dysentery proved resistant to initial treatment, adjusting her diet and medication with patient attention. One of the guards, a corporal from Texas who spoke no Japanese, learned to say "good morning" in their language and repeated it cheerfully each day during his rounds. The women began responding. Hana Sato, the first to accept coffee that initial morning, started helping in the camp infirmary, using her nursing skills to assist with other patients, wounded American soldiers, Filipino civilians, even German POWs housed in adjacent compounds. Working alongside American medical staff, she observed their techniques, noting how freely they used resources like penicillin and sulfa drugs that had been impossibly scarce in Japanese field hospitals. "I learned more about modern medicine in those weeks than in all my training in Tokyo," she later told interviewers. "The Americans had equipment, supplies, knowledge we'd never had access to. I began to understand that our suffering hadn't been noble sacrifice, but unnecessary waste, the result of a system that sent us to war without proper support." Music became another unexpected bridge. One evening in early October, someone in the American compound was playing guitar. Folk songs, popular tunes from home. The sound drifted across to the women's barracks where several of the Japanese nurses sat outside enjoying the rare moment of coolness after a hot day. One of them, Michiko Tanaka, no relation to Fumiko, began humming along, then singing softly in Japanese, adapting the unfamiliar melody to familiar words. An American nurse passing by stopped to listen. Then she began singing too, the English lyrics interweaving with Michiko's Japanese in an unplanned harmony that made no linguistic sense but somehow worked emotionally. Other women emerged from the barracks. more American staff gathered. For perhaps 20 minutes, two groups who had been enemies weeks earlier shared music across the language barrier, connected by the universal human need for beauty amid hardship. Fumiko, watching this scene, felt something shift fundamentally. That night, I stopped thinking of Americans as the enemy and started thinking of them as people. It sounds simple, but for someone raised on propaganda that dehumanized everyone outside Japan, it was a profound change. I couldn't hate people who made music like that. I couldn't fear people who shared chocolate and brought flowers and learned to say good morning in my language. The women also began communicating more with each other, processing their shared experience aloud. Late-night conversations in the barracks revealed that most had harbored private doubts about the propaganda even before capture, but none had felt safe expressing skepticism. Now, comparing their expectations to reality, they could acknowledge openly how thoroughly they'd been deceived. We talked about the soldiers we'd treated who'd died rather than surrender, one nurse, Keiko Yamamoto, recalled in a 1970 interview. We wondered how many of them could have survived if they'd known the truth about American treatment of prisoners. It made us angry, not at the Americans, but at our own command for lying to us, for making us so afraid that we chose suffering over potential safety. This anger was complicated by grief and guilt. These women had served the Imperial Japanese military faithfully, had believed in the cause, had sacrificed years of their youth to what they'd thought was noble purpose. Confronting the reality that much of it had been based on lies required rebuilding their understanding of themselves and their country. The American staff navigated this psychological territory carefully. They didn't demand renunciations of Japan or celebrations of American superiority. They didn't present propaganda of their own. Instead, they maintained steady, decent treatment and allowed the Japanese women to draw their own conclusions. This restraint was itself a powerful message. Confident systems don't need to force compliance. By mid-October, the barracks that had been silent for weeks became almost social. Women laughed occasionally, conversed with guards through interpreters, even made jokes. When one of the American nurses had a birthday, the Japanese women used scraps of paper and fabric to create simple decorations as a gift, a gesture of gratitude that brought Lieutenant Brennan to tears. But nothing lasts forever in war's aftermath. In late October, orders arrived. The Japanese prisoners would be transferred to a larger repatriation center in Manila, then eventually returned to Japan. The news brought mixed emotions. Home meant family, familiar language, cultural comfort, but it also meant returning to a devastated nation, explaining their survival to a society that had taught them death was preferable to capture, carrying knowledge about American humanity that contradicted what many Japanese still believed. On their final evening at Camp John Hay, the American staff organized a small gathering. Not quite a party, but a farewell meal with better food than usual and a relaxed atmosphere. Captain Morrison gave a brief speech translated by Sergeant Yamamoto, acknowledging the unusual nature of their encounter and wishing the women well in their futures. Lieutenant Brennan distributed small care packages for the journey: soap, basic medical supplies, some non-perishable food. As they prepared to board trucks the next morning, Fumiko Tanaka approached Captain Morrison. Through Sergeant Yamamoto, she delivered a message she'd composed carefully the night before. "We came here expecting death and found life. We came as enemies and leave as, not friends perhaps, but no longer enemies. We will remember this. We will tell others. Thank you for showing us that propaganda was wrong." Morrison, a man not given to emotional displays, reportedly had to look away briefly before responding. "Go home. Rebuild. Remember that war makes people do terrible things, but peace gives us the chance to do better. We tried to do better here. I hope you'll do the same when you get home." The women climbed into trucks, heading toward Manila, carrying with them memories of coffee and bacon, chocolate and flowers, music and kindness from the people they'd been taught were monsters. The journey home took 3 months. By truck to Manila, by ship to Yokohama, by train to devastated cities that barely resembled the Japan they'd left. The repatriation center in Manila housed thousands of Japanese nationals awaiting return. Soldiers, civilians, the remnants of occupation infrastructure. The women from Camp John Hay were processed alongside them, enduring bureaucratic delays and overcrowded conditions that contrasted sharply with their recent treatment. But even here, the American administration maintained Geneva Convention standards: adequate food, medical care, no deliberate cruelty. During this waiting period, the women encountered other Japanese prisoners with vastly different stories. Some had been held in brutal conditions by forces that didn't share Captain Morrison's commitment to humane treatment. Others had survived the final months of war through pure luck, evading capture entirely. When the Camp John Hay women shared their experiences, the breakfast, the chocolate, the music, many listeners reacted with disbelief or accused them of fabrication. The idea that Americans could be kind to Japanese prisoners contradicted not just propaganda, but the lived experience of many who'd suffered genuine atrocities. "We learned to be careful about what we shared," Fumiko Tanaka recalled. "Some people weren't ready to hear that the Americans who'd killed their comrades could also be decent to prisoners. It was easier for them to believe we were lying than to accept such complexity." The ship that finally carried them to Japan in December 1945 was crowded and uncomfortable, but nothing compared to the hell ships that had transported Allied prisoners under Japanese control. The American crew maintained order, provided basic rations, and treated the passengers as displaced persons rather than despised enemies. When they finally saw Japan's coastline after months of uncertainty, many wept, from relief, from grief, from the overwhelming weight of returning to a nation transformed by total defeat. The Japan that greeted them was unrecognizable. American occupation forces controlled major cities. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ruins. Tokyo had been devastated by firebombing. Millions were displaced, hungry, traumatized. The imperial system that had defined Japanese identity for generations had collapsed into Emperor Hirohito's humiliating surrender broadcast and subordination to General MacArthur's authority. For the returning nurses, this devastation created an impossible emotional landscape. They had survived, yes, but survival brought guilt. Why had they lived when so many had died? Why had they experienced kindness when their countrymen had suffered? How could they explain that American captivity had been the safest period of their war? Most of the women scattered to different parts of Japan, returning to families who'd believed them dead. Fumiko found her parents alive, but her childhood home in Tokyo burned to ashes. Hana Sato discovered her family had been killed in the Hiroshima bombing. Yuki Kawamura returned to Osaka to find her husband had died during the final months of fighting. Each carried her own burden of loss alongside the strange gift of their American treatment. For years, most stayed silent about their time at Camp John Hay. Post-war Japan was consumed with rebuilding, with processing collective trauma, with navigating American occupation. Admitting to having been captured was shameful enough without adding that the capture had involved humanity from the enemy. The women folded those memories into private corners of their minds and focused on survival in a transformed nation. But memory has a way of demanding acknowledgement. In the 1960s, as Japan's economic miracle transformed the country and a new generation came of age without direct war experience, some of the women began talking. Fumiko Tanaka published her memoir in 1968, explicitly titling it "What the Propaganda Didn't Tell Us." It received modest attention. Japan was not yet ready for widespread examination of wartime mythology, but it circulated among veterans and historians as a counter-narrative to simplified accounts of Japanese-American wartime relations. Hana Sato, who had worked in the Camp John Hay infirmary, became a prominent nurse educator in Tokyo. She incorporated her experiences into lectures on medical ethics, using her story to teach that professional standards should transcend national boundaries. The American doctors and nurses treated us as human beings first, enemies second, she told her students. That is the standard we should aspire to. Care that sees the patient, not the politics. In 1975, 30 years after their capture, several of the women participated in a Japanese television documentary about prisoners of war. Their segment, showing elderly women describing breakfast with bacon and eggs, chocolate from care packages, American nurses singing with Japanese prisoners, struck younger viewers as almost fantastical. How could such gentleness coexist with the brutality of war? The documentary also interviewed Captain Robert Morrison, by then retired and living in Ohio. Asked why he'd gone beyond minimal requirements in treating the Japanese prisoners, he gave an answer that echoed across decades. "I'd been a teacher before the war. Those women were younger than most of my former students. I couldn't see them as monsters just because our governments were at war. They were terrified kids far from home. Treating them decently wasn't noble. It was just refusing to let war make me into something I didn't want to be." The encounter between Morrison's humanity and the Japanese women's fear had created ripples that extended far beyond 1945. Several of the women became active in peace movements during the Vietnam War era, arguing that their experience proved enemies could be humanized rather than demonized. Others worked in Japanese-American friendship organizations, building cultural bridges informed by their unexpected wartime bridge. Fumiko Tanaka, in one of her last interviews before her death in 1992, reflected on the breakfast that had changed everything. "That morning, when Lieutenant Brennan handed me coffee, she didn't just feed me. She freed me from the prison of propaganda. I had been locked inside a worldview that allowed only enemies and allies, honor and shame, Japanese and other. She showed me there was a bigger world where people could simply be kind across boundaries. It took me years to fully understand that lesson, but it shaped the rest of my life." When the last of the 28 women died in 2003, Japanese historians noted that their generation carried unique psychological burdens. Survivors of war, witnesses to defeat, recipients of enemy kindness that contradicted national mythology. They'd had to rebuild not just their country, but their understanding of truth, propaganda, and what it meant to be human in a world more complex than any ideology acknowledged. The story of those 28 women whispering goodbyes before receiving breakfast reminds us that war's cruelties are choices, not inevitabilities. Captain Morrison and his staff chose humanity when they could have chosen indifference. The Japanese nurses chose to question propaganda when they could have clung to familiar certainties. Both sides chose to see each other as people rather than categories. History remembers the battles, the strategies, the political decisions. But transformation happens in smaller moments. A cup of coffee offered across enemy lines, chocolate shared despite language barriers, music that finds harmony in difference. These moments don't erase war's horrors or justify its existence. They simply prove that even in war's darkest chapters, human decency remains possible for those brave enough to practice it. The war ended twice for those 28 women. Once when Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio announcing surrender, and again when they learned that the monsters of their nightmares were actually just people who brought coffee, eggs, and bacon, and in doing so offered something more precious than freedom: the truth.